Hello to all who have tuned in. Welcome to Fractured Poet, a podcast for all of you poetically insane individuals who love getting lost in the art of poetry. Podcasting from Ontario, California, I am your host, Katrina Wisniewski, just another person in the world obsessed with words, striving to make sense of it all. Today's episode, like the previous, has a lot to do with writing poems about poems. I will try my very best to not repeat things, and I know I always say it because I know I've already mentioned in previous episodes, but if I do, again, I apologize in advance. This first poem basically describes yet another moment in one of my many challenges I have had writing poetry. As a poet, there are rules one must follow in order for a piece of work to be considered a poem. Speaking for myself, not only do I have to follow rules, but when I get an overabundance of words crowding my thoughts, it is very difficult, to say the least, to try and sort out those words and plug them into the right places that make sense. This first poem I am going to read is called The Process of Elimination. I must find a way to unscramble these words of mine. Let them flow and keep me on the straight and narrow. To understand the process of elimination is complicated. Everything has to be just right. No mistakes. As short as this poem is, it does explain a lot in just a few words, which honestly is the whole point of a poem. It's like summarizing what you want to say with as little words as possible. I have had many moments as a poet where I have an X amount of phrases or words that I want to use in one poem, but they don't necessarily go together once I start the poem. I can write or type up an entire poem and it literally does not sound right and the words don't mesh well. And that's pretty much what this poem is saying. I have had to find ways to unscramble the words I have in order for them to make sense and flow in a natural way in one poem. I know eventually I will have to sacrifice and eliminate words or phrases I am fond of, so a particular phrase or poem can work. Everything has to be perfect when writing a poem, but then again, there's really no such thing as perfect when it comes to poetry, at least in my opinion. I mean, take me for example, doing this podcast. I am choosing poems that I wrote years ago and working them into each episode carefully. But once I actually start planning out what I want to say, I realize that that particular poem sounds like shit. It doesn't make sense to me. The words don't look right. They don't sound right. Just the entire poem is crap. And that's when things have to be redone and rearranged somehow. I have done this numerous times over the course of planning out this podcast. I choose a poem, come back to it when I'm ready, read it, hate it, then spend who knows how long reconstructing the poem. And in the end, it comes out to a completely different poem that does not sound like what I initially chose. So this second poem does not have a title. However, the type of poem I'm about to read is called a limerick. To find the perfect words, not all poets are wizards. Attempting to create a masterpiece, it is our only chance to prove our expertise, because sometimes poets never find the words. Alright, so this poem was an impromptu poem. I did not have any more poems about poetry, therefore I had to write one on command while coming up with this episode, writing it out anyway. Again, the type of poem I just read is called a limerick, which is a 5-line poem with single stanzas. Limericks do follow a rhyming scheme, which is AABBA, which means the last word of the first line starts off the rhyming. The last word of the second line must rhyme with the last word of the first line. The next 2 lines start a different type of rhyme, the last words having to rhyme with each other. and the last line of the poem, from what I gather, ends with the same word as the first line. I know to some that don't follow poetry, don't write poetry, I know that sounded over the top confusing with me explaining it the way that I did, but once you start tackling the poem, once you start writing it, it gets easier. And if you look it up on your own, you can see, I mean, don't take my word for it. If what I just said was just completely gibberish to you, look up limerick, see what it is about, and, you can figure it out on your own and tackle it at your own leisure. But the thing that helps me through writing poems is using a thesaurus or a rhyming dictionary. For example, I type in things like another word for perfect. And once the results come up, I go through the list of words that is provided and choose the word that I want to use that I believe fits well in the poem I'm trying to write. Or the websites I like using most for rhyming is either wordhippo.com or rhymer.com. Both websites actually give a long list of different words, whether it's for rhyming or some other alternative word. But enough of giving you a brief lesson on limerick poems. So as I mentioned, this was an impromptu poem. To be honest though, for some reason or another, I had a line stuck in my head from the Batman Returns movie when Selena Kyle had abruptly left Bruce Wayne's house after watching a news report about the Ice Princess being kidnapped. So the scene goes, after Bruce Wayne leaves the room, Selena Kyle realizes that she needs to go as well and asked Alfred if he could figure out, quote, a sonnet or a dirty limerick to tell Bruce, explaining her departure. I ended up looking for different types of poems and found limerick and what those type of poems consist of and what guidelines I needed to follow, if any. So yeah, I had the word limerick in my head, knowing now that it was poetry related, and I wanted to know how to write one, and I did. This poem, even though it is a 5-liner, does give relevance to being a poet. As a poet, you strive to find the perfect words, so to speak, to create a poem. And as the poem mentions, not all poets are wizards. Words don't always pop up at any given time, marking the way to our success in finishing a poem. It is almost as if we, the poet, are striving to prove something. Like we need to prove our expertise as a poet so people recognize us as a success, relevant. But unfortunately, poets don't always find those perfect words or even find the words they want to find at all, if, again, that makes sense. Being a poet can sometimes be such a clusterfuck of a job to accomplish, even if you know what you're doing. And since the poems I chose to read for this episode are on the short side, I think I might throw in another short one. I happened to write a poem after I wrote the first limerick. It may or not have anything to do with the struggles of being a poet, but maybe if you let your mind wander, it could very well have everything to do with a poet's struggle. Again, no title for this one because of the short notice of writing a poem on the spot, but it's another 5-liner limerick. To paint a picture in her mind, some think she is blind. The colors in her head become a blur, struggling to put the pieces together. I'm afraid she might lose her mind. So as I mentioned before even reading that, this was another impromptu poem, a limerick. I had an idea of what I wanted to write theme-wise anyway, and I am not really sure if it came out the way I intended it to. The lines to paint a picture in her mind could indeed relate to myself trying to figure out a poem to write. I have all of these phrases and words stuck in my head, and I am trying to sort them out. However, some might think she is blind could indicate that she may believe that she is not a real poet because she cannot write on command, when clearly I just did. The colors in her head become a blur could be cryptic. The word colors could actually mean words. The words in her head have become a blur because there are so many. It is difficult to sort them out and decipher which one goes where, hence the struggling to put the pieces together. In conclusion, this could bring her down a crazy path and cause her to lose her mind. After all, the process is borderline insanity. Well, all of you lovely people, I am afraid that concludes the show. To those of you who are always tuning in, and even to those who are just joining in, I hope you like what you heard today and tune in next time. You can catch this and future episodes at anchor.fm/fractured poet. This episode of Fractured Poet was written and produced by me, Katrina Wisniewski. Music by Alternative Rock Volume 1 and Rock Electronica Volume 4 from a website called freeplaymusic.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at Fractured Poet. And as always, thanks for listening, and until next time.